أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولا تقولوا لمن يقتل في سبيل الله أموات بل أحياء ولكن لا تشعرون. And say not of those who are killed in the cause of Allah that they are dead. Nay, they are living, only you perceive not. Chapter 2, verse 155. In commentary of this verse, Hazrat Muslim Maud Riziyallahu anhu explained the reasons why people would consider a person who has died and given his life for the sake of Allah Almighty as being dead. And it all comes back to people not recognizing the value in sacrificing one's life for a cause, whether it is a religious cause or even a political cause. Whenever someone believes in something, then they are ready to die for the sake of that cause because of understanding the value of that cause. And for that reason, people have died for many things throughout history, and we glorify and we honor them for that reason. People who have died for their country, for their ideology, for any opinion that they stood for as a right and an inalienable human right, we have recognized and valued their having given them their lives for that cause. Even though they didn't do it with any promise of a life in the hereafter or a paradise. But still, that was a sacrifice that they willingly made. So this ability to be able to sacrifice ourselves on an individual level because of our understanding of the social benefits is what makes us distinctly human in many ways. It's what makes us social animals and selfless beings as opposed to selfish individual beings. So for this is something that is ingrained into our nature on a certain level, on one level or the other. It is something that we all appreciate. And so Huzur explained this is why tash'urun is used at the end of this verse. وَلَكِنْ لَا تَشْعُرُونَ. That they are living, they are not dead. Those who think that they are dead, they do not perceive. And the word shu'ur explains what is referred to here. Because Huzur explained that there is a difference between knowledge, which is ilm, and shu'ur, which is perception, internal perception. When a person comes to know something from external information, that is ilm. He comes to know something, he becomes an alim. But shu'ur refers to that information that we learn from reflecting on ourselves from within ourselves. That is why sher or shairi comes from that same root as well. What a person writes in couplets and poetry is not something that he necessarily gains from books and information. The whole purpose of poetry is to draw from within ourselves and say something that other people will recognize within themselves as well. That is good poetry. A good book is something that provides us with information, external information, that gives us new external information, but good poetry is not something that's necessarily that. Our definition of good poetry is completely different. A good poem is something that rings true from something that already exists within ourselves, a truth that we already know. And when we read it, we are reminded of that reality that we were not fully aware of, but then we identified within ourselves. So a good book is something that gives us good external information. A good poem is something that incites something from within and awakens something from within. So here Allah Ta'ala says and uses this specific word that وَلَكِنْ لَا تَشْعُرُونَ, that this understanding or this perception of the value of sacrificing one's own life is something that comes as a result of this internal perception that we have. And those people who do not understand this, they lack the shu'ur. So this desire for self-sacrifice for the greater good is something that is ingrained into all of us. Then after this comes chapter 2, verse 156, which is وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. And we will try you with something of fear and hunger, and loss of wealth and lives and fruits, but give glad tidings to the patient. The word bala, Hazrat Muslim Maud Riziyallahu anhu explained, means to reveal the good or evil in something, as we've gone over before. And Huzur explained that this has three meanings or three ways that it manifests itself. One purpose of an ibtila is so that the person giving the test may know the condition of the person who is being tested. The second meaning is so that the person who is being tested should know his own condition. And the third meaning is that the people who are observing the test should know what the condition of the person who is being tested is. All three of these hold true in different aspects in any kind of ibtila. But when it comes to an ibtila that comes from Allah Almighty, then only the second two meanings apply. Some people ask the question that why does Allah Almighty test us if He already knows the future? They ask this question because they are only aware of 1/3 of the meanings of the word of ibtila. The second two meanings are extremely important, so that we may know, we who are tested may know what our actual condition is, which remains hidden to us. And also the third meaning, which is that others may know. And one of the wisdoms of this is that Allah Almighty tries His saints and His prophets, so that we may observe that trial and recognize how a true saint bears every trial with love for the sake of Allah Almighty. That third meaning is something that does not apply generally to ordinary believers, but it applies to true saints and true people of Allah Almighty, that a trial comes upon them not to show Allah Almighty, obviously He is all-knowing, nor to show that prophet, because that prophet already knows and is aware of his own capacities. Allah Almighty has protected him. But it is to show the rest of us what a true characteristic of patience is and what the true goodness that exists which is hidden within that person. Now in this verse there are 5 things that are described, and Huzur explained that these are the 5 stages of persecution and trials that progressively come upon a community as they face trials from their opponents. The first is khawf, or fear. When a community is persecuted, they are initially threatened. They are not caused any harm, but there are threats which come to them. Then after that, there is hunger. They are boycotted. They lose opportunities which otherwise would exist for them. And because of this, they have to face all types of actual hunger and loss of opportunities. Then the third is an actual physical loss of wealth, where then when people are not content with just threatening and boycotting true believers in every aspect of life, but they actually actively start to break the law and rob them of their wealth and steal what they have from them. Then after this comes the loss of lives, which is the actual murder and killing of believers. And lastly is athamarat, which has the meaning of fruits, but also has the meaning of children and offspring. And this is one of the most sensitive trials for a person. People would rather sacrifice their own life than have the sad lives of their children sacrificed. So to see one's children killed and kidnapped and persecuted is a far greater suffering for a person, for any parent, than to have to bear that suffering themselves. So this 5th point is a very difficult trial that a person has to go through. And this is why some of the greatest examples of sacrifice in the history of Islam are sacrifices by mothers who sent their children forward into battle, fully willing and ready for them to be able to give their lives. In fact, sending them forward with this message that you should be willing to sacrifice your lives for the sake of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. We also know very recent examples of this, of one mother who sent her son to the masjid in Lahore right after the terrorist attack and told him to stand in the same place that her father had stood in and where he had been killed for the sake of his religion. So these are the 5 stages of persecution that a people go through. Now here we can gauge ourselves for our own tarbiyat, where we stand in our readiness according to this verse to come under the category of as-sabirin. Because as-sabirin are given 2 glad tidings in these verses. Firstly, in the previous verse, Allah Ta'ala said, Inna Allaha ma'as sabirin, that seek help with patience and prayer, because surely Allah is with those who are sabirin. And then secondly, after these trials, He says, Fabashir is-sabirin, give glad tidings and good news to the sabirin, the steadfast. So here we have to gauge ourselves according to these 5 varying criteria of what level of sabr we stand on. The first is that when people are threatened, now when we face threats, when people face threats in our society for being Muslims, how many people start to buckle at that stage? We know many people, and we observe it, people who are weak in their faith. They face no actual loss yet, but they just face threats from society around them, and they start to buckle under that pressure and start to abandon their Islamic principles. Right now, this is something that we observe happening in our society. Islamophobia is on the rise. How are Muslims reacting to this? How are we as Ahmadis reacting to this? Have we started to compromise on certain points of our faith as a result of that fear? And how do we observe it in others so that we can recognize it within ourselves if, God forbid, it starts to come? So this is only the first stage, fear. This is nothing. This is only the beginning of the process. So fear is the first stage that we must overcome to fulfill the first of 5 criteria of sabr. Then the next is actual hunger. When a person starts to face real negative consequences of those threats, when they are actually boycotted. This is also something that is happening. Statistics show that Muslims who are visibly Muslim, especially Muslim women, unfortunately, are facing more persecution. They lose greater educational and employment opportunities. It is a type of active boycott that is happening, not consciously necessarily, we can say, for the most part, but subconsciously it is entered into our society. So this is also a fear that a person has to face. When they go into an interview whether it is for university or whether it is for a job, do they go in looking visibly Muslim? Or do they compromise on that? This is the second phase where a person faces, in the very slight levels, but later a very direct form of boycott. This is also where we see people start to buckle. People who overcome the fear of threats, then when they actually fear a loss to their future opportunities, educational and work opportunities, some Muslims start to buckle there and compromise on their Islamic principles. Then after this, of course, comes a direct persecution, where people are robbed of their wealth. There, unfortunately, some people fall off. Then when people's lives are threatened, other people who are weaker in faith start to fall off in order to save themselves. And then to save their children from that same persecution, other believers start to fall off. So these are all the different weaknesses that are burned away from the Muslim community. The weeds that are cut, the dead branches that are cut away from a tree gradually in these 5 stages of pruning, where eventually only the sincere believers are left, and the true and fruitful tree is left that is standing with the Prophet of Allah. So now we who wish to be part of that fruitful tree, and the loyal servants of Islam and Ahmadiyyat, must ask ourselves, engage ourselves to what extent, not just theoretically but practically, we react to these different levels of persecution that come upon a people, and to what extent we can hope that we would be among the Sabirin. If we see among our own Ahmadis, our own friends and family members, people buckling under this pressure, then that is a point of concern. That is a point where we must give advice and strengthen other people. And if we see ourselves, God forbid, buckling under any of these 5 stages, then that is also a source of concern. A mere claim of patience and steadfastness does not mean anything. If a person says that I am ready to die for the sake of Islam, but then just under the fear of threat, he abandons his Muslim identity and starts to compromise on certain Islamic teachings, then that claim of being ready to sacrifice for the 4th and 5th level of sacrifice is meaningless if he starts buckling under the 1st and 2nd level. Allah Ta'ala is not concerned with words and claims, He is concerned with actions. So this verse is also a point of productive muhasabah for us. After this comes verse number 157 of Surah Al-Baqarah. Allazina iza asabathum musibatun qalu inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Those who, when a misfortune overtakes them, they say, surely to Allah we belong, and to Him shall we return. This verse, as we know, just about all verses that start with Allazina, those who, it is continuing a description of a people who have been described in the previous verse. So the previous verse described people who go through all these different 5 stages of trials, and then وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ, give glad tidings to the steadfast. The next verse starts with the word allazina. That means it is referring to the group of people of as-sabirin that was described in the previous verse. So as-sabirin allazina iza asabathum musiba. The patient, the steadfast are those who say, when a trial overtakes them, to Allah we belong and to Him shall we return. Now this word musiba is something that has one meaning in Arabic, but then when it travels to other countries and other regions, it starts to take on slightly different meanings. In Urdu, musibat has the meaning of a misfortune that takes over a person, a difficulty, a hardship, suffering. But in Arabic, it has a slightly more broad meaning. It has a meaning of something that overtakes someone, something that a person can never escape from. A musibah is not something that a person goes towards, but something that finds a person. Now this obviously has a connotation of something that is negative, because obviously a person goes towards something that is positive. He is only overtaken by something generally that is negative. And it is because of that general application that in Urdu it is taken on the more specific negative application. So musibat in Urdu is always negative, but just to recognize and understand that in Arabic it has a more broad meaning. And here we see that it is used in a verb and a noun in this verse. Asabathum, when overtakes them, musibah. Musibah is a noun. So the verb and noun are used right next to each other. Asabathum musibah. That when something that overtakes a person overtakes them, then they say that to Allah we belong and to Him we return. Now when it comes to this type of misfortune that often overtakes a person, and they're saying inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, Hazrat Muslim Maud Raziyallahu Anhu described that we are taught steadfastness and patience in the face of a shock and of a trial. And of course we know the hadith, as-sabru inda sadmatil ula. True patience is at the first shock of a trial and a hardship. A person eventually learns patience, but it is only at the beginning of that trial that really true patience matters. Otherwise everybody is sabir eventually, because we have no choice. Who's going to continue grieving and crying and wailing over something 20 years after it is gone? A human being has to move on. We are subject to our circumstances. So that first initial shock is what matters most. And here Huzur describes that what the Holy Qur'an describes is those people who are steadfast from the very beginning. Now there are many people who begin to wail and scream and protest against Allah Almighty when a trial comes. This is the height of foolishness. And Huzur describes many reasons of why this is foolishness, which is actually described in these words of Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. One is simply in the words Inna lillahi, that everything belongs to Allah Almighty. When a person wails and screams and protests against God, it implies that some harm has been done to them. That Allah Ta'ala, who has taken away that loved one, in some way harmed that person or harmed them. Whereas Allah Ta'ala is our creator. A creator would never harm his own creation. He always looks for the best interest of his creation. So if a person has gone back to Allah Ta'ala, they have not gone back to a monster, God forbid, they have gone back to their creator. And if Allah Ta'ala has taken something from us, then it is only something that was given to us as a trust in the first place. For us to have thought that it belonged to us was a delusion, whether from a religious or a secular perspective. A person doesn't have to believe in God to understand the foolishness of wailing and protesting the loss and the death of someone would never belong to us in the first place, even from a purely secular perspective. So Inna Lillahi teaches us this aspect. But also we must remember that this doesn't mean that we are taught to be stone-hearted and cold. Because it is mentioned in hadith that in one instance, one of the granddaughters of the Holy Prophet, the grandsons of the Holy Prophet ﷺ passed away. And when the dying child was placed in his arms, then tears started flowing from his eyes. And his companions asked him that, O Messenger of Allah, you cry. And he said that Allah Almighty has placed mercy in my heart. Now, there's a difference here which is described between crying and wailing. In fact, in one hadith, it is the difference is described that the difference between crying and wailing is that when a person mourns under the permissibility of Allah Ta'ala, it is a mourning from the eyes. But what is impermissible is what comes from the mouth. When a person begins to scream, that is impermissible and against the dignity of a Muslim. But the mourning and the weeping that a person does from their eyes is of course something that is fine. Now, to understand the real psychological difference between crying and weeping, Huzur gave a beautiful example of the time of a marriage. When the rukhsati happens of a bride, then naturally the parents feel sadness. And many times the bride and her parents cry when they are sending their daughter off to the home of her new husband. But they are crying because they're going to miss her. And she's going to miss her home. It's a natural emotion. Nobody can deny it. But also they know that they are sending her to a better place. When a girl reaches adulthood and becomes a woman, then her potential lies in her marriage. It doesn't lie in the home of her parents, it lies in the home of her husband. She has capacities which only come out in the home of her husband. So for a girl and a woman to continue to live her whole life in the house of her parents is of no benefit to that woman. So she has to leave eventually. And that leaving is a blessing and it is a good thing. But still parents cry at that time. It doesn't mean that they don't recognize the value of her leaving and the better place that she is going to and how it is better for her. It's just a natural sadness of parting that both parties feel. Now imagine if the parents and the girl were to start wailing and protesting and screaming in the way that some people do when their loved one passes away and dies. How foolish it is. If someone is going to wail and protest at that time, it's an insult almost to the husband's face. It's an insult to themselves. Why did they even consent to a marriage if they were going to behave in this way and start protesting? Is a cultural aspect sometimes, and for other reasons, sometimes people behave in this way at a rukhsati, but it is the height of foolishness. Because it implies that a person does not recognize the whole purpose of why they are doing a marriage. So this is the difference between crying and wailing, the difference between wisdom and emotion and having a soft heart, and the difference between foolishness. So similar is the difference between a person who loses a loved one. When a person wails, then they think that their loved one has, God forbid, gone to Satan, has gone to an evil person who thinks to do them harm. But a person who recognizes that a death is like a rukhsati, where a person returns to their creator, and a person returns and goes to a place where their capacities are going to come in a better way in the spiritual hereafter, then although they cry because of the parting that happens, they miss that person naturally, but they do not wail because that would be a protest against Allah Almighty and a protest against common sense. So this is the proper type of grieving that Allah Ta'ala has taught us. And this proper approach to the etiquettes of grieving comes only from a genuine understanding and recognition of the reality that we are facing. A person can only practice as-sabru inda sadmatil ula when he recognizes and understands what loss is, what possessions are, what the loss of possessions are. There a person is steadfast in the face of suffering. But when a person does not even recognize and understand what loss is, what a possession is, then they react to it in the wrong way and they go against that etiquette. So this verse of the Holy Qur'an really just points out to us common sense principles that a person forgets at that emotionally intense time of loss. And so Allah Ta'ala says that وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ, that give glad tidings to those who are steadfast. When a misfortune overtakes them, they say, قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. They say a statement which comforts anyone in a state of loss, which reminds them of the reality of the situation that they are in, that to Allah we belong and to Him we return. So with this we will end today's dars and continue from here inshallah on Saturday. The weekend dars of course is not live stream, but then we will continue the live stream on Monday inshallah. So now if there's any questions that anyone has in their minds, then they can feel free to ask.
You were talking about trials that come to people.
Yes.
We see that sometimes based on the circumstances that a person is, for example, born under, whether it be through, the country that he was born in, the United States versus some third world country, or, whether a person is black or white, just because of that, they have more trials than the other. How do we explain to those people who say that, why am I being subjected? I didn't have anything to do with this.
Okay. So the question is that some people are born into a greater state of trial than other people. Some people are born into affluence, others into poverty and suffering. So then how do we explain to those people who say that I didn't do anything to deserve this suffering, so then why do I deserve it? The simple answer is that in Islam, suffering is not a bad thing. The moment a person considers suffering to be a punishment is the point where he has misunderstood the entire concept. Because if suffering is a punishment, then that means God's prophets are the most punished people ever. And also, if suffering is a punishment, that means that every progress that we make in life is a result of some punishment that was inflicted on us. Because progress is always made through suffering. Whether it is the voluntary suffering that a person imposes on themselves because of, putting themselves into school and training or military training, whatever it is, that's a suffering a person imposes on themselves. Or the suffering a person faces in circumstances. Many people go through great deals of suffering and tragedies, but it actually becomes the source of the greatest happiness for them. They develop their character in a way that they never would have been able to do otherwise, and afterwards they say that was the best thing that happened to me. Then on the other hand, there are people who go through every type of affluence. They win the lottery and it ruins their lives. So suffering in and of itself is not a good or bad thing. It is a neutral thing that we react to ourselves. Now after this comes the point that some people are born into worse circumstances, some are born into better circumstances. Here also it is something that is completely relative. A person who is born into easy circumstances, their perception of suffering is very different than a person born in difficult circumstances. People who are born in much more difficult circumstances, they bear hardships with much greater happiness and contentment. Someone else who was put into that same person's circumstances, an affluent person who's put into a poor person's circumstances, he's going to be miserable even though a poor person is perfectly happy in that situation. They're both living in the same circumstances, but their perception is very different. So here we see that many people are poor are just as happy. Just because a person is rich doesn't mean they're more happy. There's a certain level of poverty where yes, it causes suffering. But there's a certain level where a person reaches of having their needs met. After that, no matter how rich a person is, it doesn't increase their happiness. You were to bring a rich person down and he's going to be less happy than that same person who was just as happy as he was when he was rich. So here also we see that happiness is something that is based on our own perception. It is subjective to a degree. But also the third answer to the question is that if it is true that people being born in separate circumstances is somehow an injustice, is an imperfection in this world, then the question is that it's easy to object but then come up with a better system that is more perfect. Because that is what Allah Ta'ala says, that hal tara min futur, that look at this word, do you see any fault in it? In the beginning of Surah Al-Mulk, then look again and see if you can find any fault in it. But your eyes will come back fatigued and will not find anything that is wrong with it. Now here when we look at this system of unequal distribution of suffering. When we try and come up with a solution and to make the world more perfect, what do we come up with? The only thing we can come up with is a perfect communism on the level of distribution of resources. Every single person should be born into exactly the same circumstances with the same wealth. Not only the same wealth, but the same physical appearance. A person shouldn't be ugly, that's also suffering. Also with the same intelligence, the same physical capacities, everything should be equal. The solution ends up being a world that makes no sense whatsoever, because our diversity is what actually makes us human beings and what results in so much of the progress that we have made. So when a person raises this objection, then when we try out their hypothetical solution, it makes no sense. It results in a type of communism, which doesn't, in application to everything that resource that Allah Ta'ala has given to us. So the world is created based on natural selection. And this unequal distribution of resources is exactly what makes us excel one another and has made us progress to this level as human beings. And this is the situation and circumstances that we thrive in as a species. If you were to change the rules of the book, then we would all go extinct, because we're not even adapted to that imaginary world that a person comes up with based on their own philosophy. So from all these perspectives, they can give some answer to the question of why it is that these things, that it's not really a legitimate objection that everybody should get equal amount of suffering. Alrighty, so we'll end here and we'll continue inshallah on Saturday. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammad wa barik wa sallim innaka Hamidum Majid.